Okay. Hello, viewers. Welcome to another session of neurophysiology. I remain your lecturer, Umo Idiongo. And first of all, let's look at the role of the cerebral cortex in the control of body movements. Let's say the control of voluntary actions, voluntary movements. So we are going to look at the overview. What are the topics under this session? So first, we are going to see the role of the cerebral cortex in abstract thoughts, converting abstract thoughts into motor activities, carrying out decisions made in response to sensory information, planning and programming of movements, adaptability of innate or inborn patterns of movement, interactions with other motor control parts of the central nervous system, like interactions with the cerebellum, interactions with the extrapyramidal areas, interactions with the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. And then we also look at the continuous review and adjustment of the motor plans, motor commands. That continuous review is done by the connections between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So these are the overview of what we are going to look at. So first we start with the introduction to the motor system. When we talk about the motor system, it has to do with the motor cortex, the descending tracts, be it the direct and the indirect tracts. And then we have the lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons have their nuclei in the spinal cord and in the brainstem nuclei. Then we have the effectors, which are the skeletal muscles or the smooth muscles, the involuntary muscles. So motor commands are delivered by the peripheral nervous system. So impulses coming down from the motor system or the motor cortex are delivered to the effectors by the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, which you already know. So we know the functions of these two divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So the upper motor neurons, still looking at the motor system. The upper motor neurons are neurons in the brain that influence and control skeletal muscles by the skeletal muscle by lower motor neurons. So they influence the control of the skeletal muscles by synapsing directly to or indirectly with the lower motor neurons, which are the alpha and gamma motor neurons. The lower motor neurons are the final common pathway. So looking at this diagram, you still see the structure or the location of the motor cortex here. So you can see the primary motor cortex is here, and this is the premotor cortex. This whole area is the premotor cortex. So above the premotor cortex, the medial part is the supplementary motor cortex, and this is the prefrontal cortex, just in front of the premotor cortex is the premotor area or prefrontal area, sorry, that's the prefrontal area here. This is the premotor cortex here, this is the primary motor area. So the medial part of the premotor cortex is the supplementary motor area. So neurons in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex, that's the primary motor area, also known as the precentral gyrus, contribute axons that cross the contralateral sides of the pyramids at the medulla, at the level of the medulla. Those tracts are the pyramidal tracts. So those pyramidal tracts are the ones that terminate either directly on the lower motor neurons. They terminate directly on the lower motor neurons. So we also have the corticobulbar tracts. The corticobulbar tracts are the ones that terminate in the nuclei, the brainstem nuclei, and then gives rise to motor neurons supplying muscles of many structures in the head and the upper parts of the body. So those are the cortical bulbar tracts. The cortical bulbar tracts are those tracts that originate from cranial motor nerves. So that is what we are seeing there. So the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor cortex, contributes about 20% of the corticospinal tract. So when you look at the descending tracts, the precentral gyrus contributes about 20% of the fibers descending. The primary motor area, the premotor area contributes about 30%. The premotor area contributes about 30%. Then the parietal lobe, which is the primary somatosensory cortex, contributes about 40%. So the primary motor area contributes 20%. The premotor area contributes about 30%. And then the parietal lobe, which is the primary somatosensory area, contributes about 40% of the descending tracts. So we have, in the descending tract, we have the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. Those two are the direct pathways, the direct motor pathways, the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. So the supplementary motor cortex located in the superior frontal gyrus contributes about 10%. That's a supplementary motor area here. So the supplementary motor area has about 10%. The primary motor area contributes about 20%. The premotor area here, the one in blue, contributes about 30%. And the parietal lobe, the primary somatosensory area, contributes about 40% of the descending tracts that are responsible for control of voluntary movements. So those are the allocations and contributions of the motor areas, the somatosensory area inclusive. So other descending motor tracts from other parts of the brainstem are known as the extrapyramidal system. These are the indirect system now. So we also call them the voluntary system, or the involuntary system, the involuntary system, because much of their control is involuntary. So we have the vestibulospinal tracts, the tectospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract, the cerebrospinal tract. So you can see here those extrapyramidal structures. Those structures located maybe in the base of the brain, like the basal ganglia. We also have structures like the radionucleus here. We have the tectum, the tectile nucleus. We have the reticular formation here. We have the vestibular nucleus here. So all these nuclei forms the extrapyramidal system, because descending tracts coming down from those nuclei form the extrapyramidal tracts. So the extrapyramidal system has to do with these nuclei and the tracts that originate from them. So we have the pyramidal system being the motor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex, the somatosensory area, the premotor cortex, and even the prefrontal area, contributing descending tracts to the effectors or down to the lower motor neurons. Those are the pyramidal system, especially tract originating from the primary motor cortex. So I want you to be able to identify or differentiate between the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal system. So the neurons of the extrapyramidal system will make numerous connections with structures in the brain. Like in the midbrain, there are connections between some extrapyramidal tract and the midbrain, even the brainstem nuclei, even the basal ganglia, even the cerebellum also have and sends connections in between the extrapyramidal tracts or the nuclei that give rise to the extrapyramidal tracts. So still on the introduction of the motor system. So the extrapyramidal tracts are controlled by the basal ganglia, the thalamus, even the motor cortex, and the substantia nigra, which is located in the midbrain. So these descending tracts are concerned with motor activities of the body, with voluntary motor activities. So I want you to know that voluntary motor activities are those activities that are initiated voluntarily. Those activities that start voluntarily, but later on it can be taken up as it can be unconsciously controlled. So voluntary movement or activities are movements consciously activated to achieve a specific goal. Although these activities are consciously activated, the details of most of these voluntary movements or voluntary activities occur automatically. So that means maybe as you are starting to climb a staircase, you know very well that you have approached the staircase, you start climbing. 1, 2, after some time, you take off your mind. You can even remove your phone and start pressing your phone as you are climbing the steps. You are not too aware that the legs are making the movement up the stairs. So that's why I said that the extrapyramidal tracts are also known as the subconscious tracts. So the pyramidal tracts will convey the voluntary motor commands from the motor cortex. Then as the motor commands, as the movement is being executed, the extrapyramidal and subconscious tract comes in with alongside the pyramidal control, and they carry out the movement. So you find out that after some time, the voluntary movement that was initiated is now changing partly into involuntary movement or activities. So the pyramidal corticospinal tract controls conscious, has to do with conscious control of skeletal muscles. They control fine movements that require dexterity, fine movements that requires dexterity, like typing on the keyboard, like playing piano, like writing a note. Those are fine movements that require dexterity. So extrapyramidal subconscious tracts are concerned with muscle tone regulation, regulation of balance, subconscious regulation of balance, hand, eye, and upper limb position, movement, initiation of movement, posture maintenance, control of muscles of facial expression. So those are the functions of the extrapyramidal subconscious tracts. That's why they're called subconscious tracts. So this screen shows you the parts of the brain that I think you should be familiar with by now. So the somatic nervous system overview is here. So when you look at the somatic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, you see here motor pathways in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. You can see the upper motor neurons. This is the somatic nervous system. In the somatic nervous system, which is part of the motor system, you can see the upper motor neurons here and the lower motor neurons, the ones in black. So the upper motor neurons from the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, can terminate in the somatic motor nuclei of the spinal cord or terminate in the somatic motor nuclei of the brainstem, which is the corticobulbar tract. So from there, in the brainstem, the lower motor neurons will originate from the somatic motor nuclei of the brainstem to innervate the skeletal muscles. But from the somatic nuclei of the spinal cord, you have the lower motor neurons, which are the alpha and gamma motor neurons originating from the anterior horn of the spinal cord, from the somatic motor nuclei of the spinal cord to innervate the skeletal muscles, and goes to the muscle spindles, the intrafiscal and extrafiscal fibers, the Golgi tendon organs. So that is the overview of the somatic nervous system. So you read this down, this will give you more explanation on what is being illustrated here. So the motor system, the way we define it, is that system of the brain that exists to translate thoughts, sensations, emotions into voluntary movements. into fine skill movements, into muscle tone, neck muscle contraction, and limbs for posture and balance. Those are the functions of the motor system. Voluntary movement, fine skilled movements, altering muscle tone, controlling muscles and movement of the upper limb and the neck, controlling the posture, limb posture, body posture, balance. Those are the functions of the motor system. So in this diagram, you can see the motor system, the motor area. You can see here the basal ganglia structures, the extrapyramidal structures, or the extrapyramidal nuclei, those structures that gives rise to the extrapyramidal tracts. You can see the thalamus is here. You can see the putamen, part of the limbic system. You can see the subthalamic nucleus. You can see the bulboreticular formation that gives rise to some extrapyramidal tracts like the reticulospinal tracts. You can also see all of them terminating on the lower motor neurons here of the spinal cord, the motor nuclei of the spinal cord. And then arising from here, we have the lower motor neurons, which are the alpha and gamma motor neurons innervating the skeletal muscles, which are responsible for movement. So we know the cerebral cortex itself. We have known the cerebrum. We have seen the anatomy of the cerebrum, the divisions, the parts of the cerebrum. So when you're talking about the motor system, you should not forget that the cerebral cortex is the first of the components of the motor system. So that's why I said the cerebral cortex and the motor system. So you can see the divisions of the motor system there. This, you can see the parts. You can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe. You can see the cerebellar hemispheres there. So in the frontal lobe here is where the motor cortex is located, and the prefrontal area is also part of the frontal lobe, which has which plays a very good significance in the planning of motor commands, in the planning of movements. So before any movement is executed, the prefrontal cortex must first planning first before the movement is being executed. So that is what the motor cortex is, the cerebral cortex is all about. So motor areas of the cerebral cortex are shown in this diagram here in yellow. You can see here the motor areas, the precentral gyrus, the primary motor area, that's the area 4 of Brodmann. So that region is specifically known as the primary motor cortex. You can see the somatotopic organization of the motor cortex, representing all parts of the body, starting from the medial aspect of the primary motor cortex to the most lateral aspect. You can see the parts of the body that are being represented on this motor cortex. So might be experimentally stimulation of any part of this motor cortex corresponding with the parts of the limb that is being represented will cause a movement in that part of the limb. So these are motor areas being shown here that control skeletal muscles of different parts of the body. So movement of the body depends upon different groups of skeletal muscles. We are trying to explain how the cerebral cortex controls body movements. So movement of the body depends upon different groups of skeletal muscles. The muscles you have in the hands are different from the muscles of the leg. The muscles of the legs are, the muscles of the thighs are different from the muscles of the lower leg. So these are various groups of skeletal muscles. So various types of movement or motor activities brought about by these muscles are: 1, execution of smooth, precise, and accurate movement. That means execution of movement to be smooth, precise, and accurate must be brought about by the contraction of different groups of skeletal muscles. Coordination of movements responsible for skilled activities. These are the type of movements that are brought about by these different groups of skeletal muscles. Coordination of movements responsible for skilled activities. For example, during typing, it's not your whole body that will be moving when you are typing on a keyboard or typing with your phone. It's just the muscles of the fingers. So those are coordinated movements that are responsible for skilled activities. Then we also have coordination of movements responsible for posture and equilibrium maintenance. So the muscles don't only execute smooth, precise, and accurate voluntary movements, they also coordinate movements that are responsible for skilled activities. They also coordinate movements that are responsible for posture and equilibrium maintenance. Maintenance of posture is brought about by coordination and contraction of these different groups of skeletal muscles in the body. So the cerebral cortex must be in overall control of all these groups of muscles to be able to maintain posture, to be able to maintain skilled activities, and also to be able to execute smooth, precise, and accurate voluntary movements. So what happens when the cerebral cortex starts exerting control over these skeletal muscles? What are the steps that takes place? So first of all, we have signals. Signals for these voluntary motor activities are sent from different areas of the brain. Remember, we saw the areas of the brain. We saw the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. We saw the motor cortex, we saw the prefrontal area, we saw the supplementary motor cortex, and the premotor area, and the primary somatosensory area. So signals for voluntary motor activities are also sent from different areas of the brain, particularly the cerebral cortex to the spinal motor neurons. So the cerebral cortex initiates coordination and control of movement, which depends on feedback signals. Feedback signals from proprioceptors. Remember, the spinocerebellar tracts carries information from proprioceptors, which are the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs, back to the cerebellum. It sends a feedback to the cerebellum. So now the cerebellum will try to compare the movement that has been executed, the actual movement that has been executed with the planned movement that was sent to it from the motor cortex to see if actually the movement that is taking place is going according to what the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum has planned. So there are feedback signals from proprioceptors. Remember those proprioceptors that we mentioned that are located in the muscle spindles, the Golgi tendon organs. Those are the proprioceptors. So these proprioceptors sends feedback in the muscle and other sensory receptors back to the cerebellum. Interaction of other parts of the brain, such as the brainstem, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum with the motor cortex together will help to coordinate and control movements. So it's not only the cerebral cortex that is coordinating and controlling voluntary movements. The cerebellum is there, the basal ganglia is there, the brainstem is there. Okay, so the cerebral cortex does not work alone. And also there is feedback from the muscles as they are carrying out the movements back to the cerebellum to compare and contrast the movement that we planned with the motor cortex and the basal ganglia. Is it the same movement that is being executed at this time? So I want to add to you there that the central nervous system, apart from transmitting motor commands, it transmits these motor commands in response to sensory information. It transmits motor commands along with sensory information. That is why we said the cerebral cortex carries out decisions made in response to sensory information. So the response of the motor cortex is as a result of response of feedbacks from sensory information. So every time it's trying to get a feedback from the sensory parts, which is feedback signals from the proprioceptors, and then it will compare with the motor commands it has already sent to the effectors, which are the muscles. So cortical areas concerned with the origin of motor signals are the primary motor area, which we saw there, the precentral gyrus or the area 4, the premotor area, the area 6, and the supplementary motor area in the frontal lobe, which is also part of the area 6, and the sensory area in the parietal lobe. So you see those parts that are concerned with the origin of motor commands, the origin of motor commands. The prefrontal area, why the prefrontal area is not here? The prefrontal area is not here because motivation, foresight to plan and initiate movement occurs in the prefrontal area. The prefrontal area is for planning, for motivation, for initiation of movement. After the planning, the execution and the origin of the signals will come from primary motor area, premotor area, supplementary motor area in the frontal lobe, and the sensory area in the parietal lobe. These are the 4 areas that are involved in initiation, in where motor commands originate from. But the prefrontal area is only concerned with motivation, foresight to plan and initiate movement. Motivation, foresight to plan and initiate movement. For example, if you want to take a movement, you calculate your steps. You calculate, okay, if I walk from here to there, I'll climb those steps. So before the movement is even initiated by the primary motor area, premotor and supplementary motor area, the prefrontal area has already motivated the body, and it already has a foresight to plan and initiate the movements. Okay, so cortical areas that, like we have seen above, send their output signals. That is the primary motor area, premotor and supplementary motor area, and the sensory area send their signals via the descending tracts. Might be the direct or indirect. Let's say the direct motor tracts via the corticospinal tract, yes, to the brainstem. So at the brainstem, we have the crossing over of some of the fibers, which are the corticospinal tracts. So we have the crossing over of the fibers to the lateral, as the lateral corticospinal tract, to the lateral part of the spinal cord, and descend as the lateral corticospinal tract. Then we also have uncrossed fibers at the level of the medulla, which descend as the anterior corticospinal tracts. So the crossing over takes place at the level of the brainstem and the medulla. And we also have the corticobulbar tracts, which we already talked about. So the corticobulbar tracts also have crossed and uncrossed fibers, but for their own, they terminate at the brainstem motor nuclei. The brainstem motor nuclei. Okay, so that is what happens. So once the cortical area send out their output signals, those output signals will descend as the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. Not only the corticospinal tract, we saw the origin and the routes of those 2 tracts. These 2 tracts are known as the indirect, or they are known as the direct pathways, the direct motor pathways. The indirect motor pathways are the extrapyramidal tracts. So we saw this distribution of fibers coming from the primary and supplementary motor cortex, from the premotor area, from the somatosensory area as well. Don't forget the somatosensory area also contributes fibers for the motor system, and it contributes direct fibers. It might be corticospinal tract or corticobulbar tract. So when you look at this diagram, you will see the functional regions of the cerebral cortex, the primary motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatostatic area. You can also see the somastatic area too, then the somastatic association area. These are all sensory areas, sensory association areas, 1 and 2, 2 and association. This is the primary somastatic area. This is the primary motor area, the precentral gyrus. That's the primary area that the motor signals originate from. We also have motor signals originating from the premotor area. The premotor area is here, the area 6 of Brodmann. Anteriorly or superiorly is the supplementary motor area. So we also have the prefrontal area, which is involved in planning and foresight to plan, motivation, and initiation of movement. This is the prefrontal area that I've been talking about. Then we also have the Broca's speech area is located in the premotor area. This is the area that is concerned with speech, movement of the muscles of the mouth for speech, the Broca's motor speech area. So you also have the other parts of the brain or other parts of the cerebral cortex, functional parts of the cerebral cortex. This is the left cerebral hemisphere, and these are the functional parts there for you to see. So these are the functions of the cerebral frontal lobe. You can see the prefrontal cortex is here. You can see the precentral cortex is here, which has the primary motor area, the premotor area, and the supplementary motor area. You can also call it the precentral cortex. So it encompasses the premotor area, the primary motor area, as well as the supplementary motor area. Okay, so these are the Brodmann areas as it is listed, and these are the functions of those areas. The prefrontal cortex is here. So the prefrontal cortex also plays a role in emotions, learning, memory, and social behavior, as well as planning actions. It's the seat of intelligence. And it also initiates autonomic changes during emotional conditions. So it's not only the limbic system that controls emotions as well. The prefrontal cortex also plays a role in emotions. So converting abstract thought into motor activity. Converting abstract thought into motor activity, that's one of the roles of the cerebral cortex in controlling body movement. So for a voluntary movement to take place, or for you to voluntarily move one part of your body, what happens is the initiation of planning first. Plan of movement, planning of the movements by the prefrontal area. Like I said, the prefrontal area will plan the movement first, and then the movement will be initiated by the motor cortex. Okay, so after planning, arrange appropriate motion at many different joints at the same time. That's still part of planning. And then adjust the motion by comparing plan with performance. That's when we have the cerebellum coming in. So once the cerebellum comes in, what is happening there is comparing plan with performance. Comparing plan with performance. We are going to see that function of the cerebellum as we go further. We call it comparator function. Comparator function of the cerebellum. So once a movement is perceived to take place, these are the steps that will occur. Planning of the movement, arrangement of appropriate motion at different joints at the same time, adjusting the motion by comparing plan with performance. That means the movement is now executed. So sensations going back to the motor cortex will help to adjust the movement if there was an error when executing the movement. So initiation of the movement takes place. So the premotor area will play a role as well in that initiation of movement. The premotor area will play a role. That is where you have the supplementary motor cortex above. So it will play a role resulting in the stimulation of the upper motor neurons. Remember, we said that is where the signals originate from. The signals of movement originate from the premotor area, the primary motor cortex itself. So after the initiation of movement and the stimulation of the upper motor neurons, remember the upper motor neurons, the direct pathway consisting of the upper motor neurons are the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. So axons of the upper motor neurons now forming the descending nerve tract will stimulate the lower motor neurons. Okay, because they have a synapse, they have a connection with the lower motor neurons, either in the motor nuclei of the spinal cord or in the motor nuclei of the brainstem. So immediately, the lower motor neurons will stimulate the skeletal muscles to contract, and then the movement will take place. So the cortex interacts with the basal ganglia. The motor cortex interacts with the basal ganglia, or the cerebral cortex interacts with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum in planning, coordination, and execution of movement. It doesn't do it alone, like I've already said. So some indirect pathways, such as those from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, also help in fine-tuning, fine control of movements that are carried by the direct pathways. Okay, so those are the things you should note. So the motor system learns by doing. I just want to add a little explanation to how voluntary movement is initiated. So the motor system learns by doing, and performance improves with repetition. What we used to say, practice makes perfect. As you continue doing, the motor system will learn and becomes perfect when you carry out that same task another time. So that involves what we know as synaptic plasticity. As you continue practicing a movement or an activity for some time, before you know it, you become perfect. Before you know it, you can type with your phone without even looking at your phone. Before you know it, you can drive without even looking left and right. Okay, so that is what we know as synaptic plasticity. Cortical plasticity is also there. So what I want you to know is that damage to the cerebral cortex, because the cerebral cortex is the main component of the motor system. That's where the motor signals originate from. So damage to the cerebral cortex before or during childbirth, during the first 2 to 3 years of development, can lead to cerebral palsy. And in cerebral palsy, muscle tone, movements are affected. This disorder affects muscle tone, movement, and coordination, because the signals for controlling voluntary motor activities originate from the cerebral cortex. And in cerebral palsy, it's not only the cerebral cortex that is affected, even the basal ganglia is affected, because the basal ganglia also plays a role in planning and fine-tuning movement. Okay, so we go to planning and programming of movements. So research has shown that commands for voluntary movements originate in the cortical association areas as well. Commands for voluntary movements originate in the cortical association areas as well. What do I mean by cortical association areas? Those areas outside the primary motor cortex are the cortical association areas. So movements are planned in the cortex as well as in the basal ganglia, as well as in the cerebral hemispheres, with the part of the cerebellum that you call the cerebellum is involved in planning of movements. Okay. So these plannings happen before execution of movement. No movement is executed without plan. If a movement is executed without plan, the movement will be disorganized, the movement will be uncoordinated, the movement will be disintegrated. That is what you see in cerebral dysfunction, cerebellar dysfunction, even basal ganglia dysfunction. So in patients that have basal ganglia dysfunction, cerebellar dysfunction, cerebral palsy, when you see such patients trying to make a movement, you see the movement is uncoordinated, disintegrated movements, voluntary movement. You cannot even explain what the person was going to do. If the person went to pick something, the person will start moving left and right and center before he goes to pick what he wanted to pick. So that shows you the importance of the cortex, importance of planning voluntary movement before execution of that movement. So here, this diagram shows you the structures in the brain that are responsible for planning voluntary movement. Idea. The idea is conceived by the cortical association areas. Remember what I said about the prefrontal cortex. The premotor cortex is there for initiation of movement. The basal ganglia is also there for planning. The lateral cerebellum is also there for planning. So that's why I said here, the basal ganglia and cerebellum funnel information to the premotor and motor cortex by the way of thalamus. You can see the premotor cortex is here. The cortical association areas are here. Those areas outside the primary motor cortex, like the prefrontal area, they are there to conceive the idea. They have the motivation for the movements. They plan the movements. They have the concept of the type of movement to take place, okay? So now, the basal ganglia, the lateral cerebellum are now involved in planning. So once the cortical association areas conceive that idea and motivation to plan, to make a movement, they share that idea with the basal ganglia and the lateral cerebellum. The lateral cerebellum is also known as the cortical cerebellum. So the lateral cerebellum and the basal ganglia share the information that they have gotten from the cortical association area with the premotor and motor cortex by the way of the motor thalamus. The thalamus is here. The thalamus is also here in between. So they share with the premotor and motor cortex. Remember, the premotor and motor cortex are the ones that will initiate the movements. So you see the way the movement has come out. It starts from the idea to plan to execution. So this is now execution. So the premotor and motor cortex will now execute movement. And then there is a continuous feedback from the premotor and motor cortex to the spinal cerebellum via the ready nucleus to the cerebellum, the spinal cerebellum. So this information comes back from the movement that is being executed to the cerebellum, comparing plan and performance, comparing the actual movement and what was planned. So the movement will also be fed back to the intermediate cerebellum or the spinal cerebellum via the pathway of the ready nucleus. And the intermediate cerebellum will share that feedback with the premotor and motor cortex. In case there is an error in the movement, the premotor and motor cortex will adjust the executed movement and correct the error so that the movement will be precise and smooth, voluntary movement. Okay? So this is the flow chart of planning and programming of movement. You see the basal ganglia is involved, the motor cortex is involved, the cerebellum is involved, all of them are involved. So motor commands from the motor cortex are relayed part via the corticospinal tract to the spinal cord and the corresponding corticobulbar tracts to the motor neurons in the brainstem. We've already explained this. So, however, collaterals from the corticospinal and corticobulbar pathways and a few direct connections from the motor cortex end on the brainstem nuclei and the projector-motor neurons in the brainstem. Okay, motor neurons in the oculomotor nerve, motor neurons in the glossopharyngeal nerve that gives rise to glossopharyngeal nerve. Those are motor nuclei in the brainstem. So they also direct those motor information. Those motor information are also transmitted not only from the corticospinal tract, not only to the corticospinal tract, to the spinal cord, but also via the corticobulbar pathways that ends on the brainstem nuclei, which will give rise to lower motor neurons arising from the brainstem nuclei, such as some cranial nerves. We know some cranial nerves are motor and sensory at the same time, okay? So these pathways also mediate voluntary movement as well. Like I've said, those pathways from the brainstem nuclei. That's what we're trying to explain there. So carrying out decisions made in response to sensory information. That's the first thing I said. So I said that movement, the central nervous system transmits motor commands in response to sensory information. So there's a continuous connection between the somatosensory area and the motor area. There is a communication between the supplementary motor area involved in planning, organizing motor sequences, and the somatosensory area. Okay, there is always a connection. So the movement that you are seeing is as a result of a kind of response from sensory information. So the motor cortex and the sensory cortex work together. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. So the supplementary motor area may be involved in planning, organizing, and executing movements, while the primary motor cortex executes the movements. Mainly, both regions, the supplementary and the primary motor cortex, also known as M1, are involved in voluntary movements when the movements being performed are complex and involve planning. In short, all the movements that are executed are complex and they involve planning. It's just that most of these movements are so, most of these voluntary movements are so involuntary that sometimes you don't even think about it before you execute the movement. Okay, so the supplementary motor area and the primary motor area, they are all involved in planning, organizing, and execution of movements, especially the primary motor area, which is mainly involved in execution of movements, okay? So what were we trying to say here? Once movement is executed, movement set up alterations in sensory input from spatial senses. For example, as you are walking, you are also looking around. You are conscious about a car coming around. You are conscious about a pothole that you might not put your leg. You are conscious about water on the ground so that you not put your leg and fall down. So once movement is initiated and the movement is carried out, this movement will set up alterations in sensory inputs from spatial senses and even from muscles, tendons, joints, and skin, okay? For example, if you are walking on the road and it starts raining, once the water touches, oh, it starts raining, let me find somewhere and stand, okay, till the rain finishes. So movement set up alterations in sensory inputs. That is why I'm saying that movement is carried out in response to sensory information. So this feedback information, feeding back to the central nervous system, adjusts and smoothens movement and is relayed directly to the motor cortex. So once that feedback comes in to the cerebellum via the spinocerebellar tracts, it is fed back directly into the motor cortex, okay? And the motor cortex finds a way of comparing the executed movement. Is there any adjustment I need to do to this movement? Motor cortex can send out adjustments via the corticospinal tract. So feedback information adjusts and smoothens movement and is relayed directly to the motor cortex and to the spinocerebellum, like I've just said. So the whole thing is on this slide when we're talking about execution of movement. So once movement is executed, there is always a feedback to the primary premotor and motor cortex, so that if there is any adjustment, the motor cortex will always continue to adjust the executed movement and also compare the movements the executed movement with the intended movement. Is the movement going according to the plan that was done here? So that is why the movement is always fed back. If it's not going according to plan, the premotor and motor cortex will adjust that movement, carrying out decisions made in response to sensory information. That's what we are still on. So the spinal cerebellum projects in turn to the brainstem nuclei, the radionucleus, and the main brainstem pathways that are concerned with posture and coordination are from the radionucleus, especially the reticulospinal tracts, the tectospinal, and the vestibulospinal tracts are the ones that are concerned with posture and coordination. So the spinal cerebellum, as it projects back to the motor cortex, it also projects to the extrapyramidal tracts that will help to adjust and coordinate motor commands or execution of the movements. Okay, so this is what I have shown you in this diagram. So the cerebellum provides feedback to adjust and smoothen movement. Adjust and smoothen movement. It will also provide a feedback. The cerebellum is here. So the cerebellum will provide a feedback either via the extrapyramidal system by having connections with the extrapyramidal system, or it provides a feedback to the motor cortex. The motor cortex will automatically have a direct connection with the corticospinal tract, as well as the cerebellum with the extrapyramidal system, with the rubrospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract as well. So those extrapyramidal systems also have connections with the lower motor neurons. So two of them will play a role in adjusting the movement that is carried out in response to the sensory information that has been fed back to the motor cortex. So what is the role of the premotor cortex in movement? We know that the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex are located almost in the same area. That's the area 6 of Brodmann. What is the role? The premotor cortex plays a role in also execution of movement, as well as planning. It receives input from the sensory regions of the parietal cortex. So there's a connection between the premotor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus. So it receives input from sensory regions of the parietal cortex and projects to the primary motor cortex, the spinal cord, and the brainstem reticular formation. Remember, in the brainstem reticular formation, that's where we have the extrapyramidal system, like the reticulospinal tract, having their origins from there, and they are concerned with maintenance of posture. Maintenance of posture. So the premotor cortex is also concerned with setting posture. It sets posture at the start of movement. Setting posture, like when you want to walk, if you were sitting in a sitting position, you first of all stand up, and then you start walking. So researchers have shown that it is also concerned with setting posture at the start of a planned movement and with getting the individual prepared to move. That is the premotor cortex for you. That is one of the functions. So it is also involved in control of proximal limb muscles, limb muscles that are on the proximal part of the body, the upper part of the body. Proximal limb muscles needed to orient the body for movement. Those are the functions of the premotor cortex, okay? So the somatosensory cortex, what is the role of the somatosensory cortex in movement? Remember, movement, voluntary movement is a kind of integrated activity. It's not only the motor cortex that is responsible for movement. Is a kind of a coordinated action that involves different parts of the brain. It's not only the motor cortex. We have the somatosensory cortex, the premotor cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the extrapyramidal tracts, the extrapyramidal nuclei as well. So the posterior parietal cortex, which is also known as the somatosensory cortex, also has a role to play in movement. So surprisingly, the somatosensory cortex area and other parts of the cerebral cortex related to the posterior parietal lobe projects to the premotor cortex. Remember, we said the premotor cortex also have communications with the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. So these somatosensory cortex also have connections and projects to the premotor cortex. That is the feedback we are talking about, the sensory feedback. So once the sensory feedback is coordinated with the premotor cortex, the execution of movement will be very smooth. So as the movement is being executed, changes in the movement are being detected and sent back to the motor cortex. So you see the premotor and the somatosensory motor cortex work together. While this one is receiving sensations, is sharing it with the premotor cortex, which is also involved in carrying out voluntary or motor movements. So neurons in this posterior parietal cortex also contribute to the descending pathways. We said 40%. 40% of the descending tracts are contributed by the posterior parietal cortex. So the posterior parietal cortex contributes descending pathways that are involved in motor control as well. So the posterior parietal cortex still on its role in movements. When there is a lesion or injury to the somatic sensory area, it will cause defects in motor performance that are characterized by inability to execute learned sequences. Lesions in the somatic sensory area, somatosensory cortex, okay? We also have what we know as ataxia as well. We have apraxia, which is injury to the premotor area. When there is an injury or lesion to the premotor area, it will lead to a condition known as apraxia. Lesions in the somatic sensory area can cause a defect in the motor performance that are characterized by inability to execute learned sequences or movements, a sequence that an individual had already known how to do it. Once there's an injury to that somatosensory area, the individual will find it difficult to carry out those sequences of movements that he or she had already known. So we talk about cortical plasticity. I had already mentioned cortical plasticity in the motor system. I said the motor system learns by doing. Practice makes perfect. As you continue executing or carrying out a particular kind of activity, motor activity, there will come a time that you become perfect. So cortical plasticity is the one to account for that. So the cortical areas of output to other muscles increases in size when the motor learning involves this muscle. Remember, we had the representation of the motor cortex, okay? Somatotopic organization of the motor cortex. The whole body is represented in the motor cortex, okay? So cortical areas that are linked to those muscles of different parts of the body increases in size when motor learning involves these muscles. So the continuous use of a particular part of the body increases the size or the area in which that part of the body is being represented in the cerebral cortex. Okay, that's what I've explained there. So under plasticity, we also have what we know as reorganization of the cortex. For example, damage to a particular area of the motor cortex, maybe due to ischemia or lesion, maybe that area that is controlling a particular part of the body can lead to reorganization of the motor cortex. Another area will be assigned to that part of the body in which the ischemia or the lesion had damage in the motor cortex. So it can be an adjacent undamaged part of the cortex that will be assigned to carry out the functions of the damaged motor cortex that was controlling the particular part of the body. So in the continuous review and adjustment of motor commands, we talked about the cerebellum. I'd already told you about the cerebellum. Comparator functions of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is there during movement to compare plan and performance. The actual movement and the intended movement, are they the same? The cerebellum is there collecting feedback from the spinal cerebellum. The spinal cerebellum carries sensations from the muscle spindles, the proprioceptors located in the joints, the Golgi tendon organs. So the cerebellum provides coordination of voluntary movements and also plays a role in motor learning. The spinal cerebellum especially. So motor learning by playing a major role in fine-tuning motor programs to make accurate movements. So you find that in learned movements, at first starting to carry out, to execute the learned movements, the movements might not be precise and perfect, but with time, as you continue making the movement, motor learning, the cerebellum learns and memorizes the type of movements you want to do. And subsequent movements, you'll be able to make an accurate, precise movement. For example, taking free kicks, like I said about C. Ronaldo in Manchester United. Before he used to take free kicks, he had to learn. He took a very long time to learn how to take free kicks from a very young age. So with time, he was so perfect in the free kicks that anywhere he stands on the pitch, he might score. The probability that he's going to score is 99%. So motor learning, that's what the cerebellum provides. That is the role of the cerebellum in continuous review and adjustment of motor commands. Adaptability of innate and stored patterns of movement. We are all born with innate motor patterns. So these motor patterns are subjected to maturation and modification through learning. Remember, the motor system learns by doing. As it continues doing, it continues perfecting itself. From when a child was very young, he started walking. You see the steps of a 1-year-old child is not perfect like the steps of a matured adult. So with time, the child starts growing and starts walking. With time, he starts running. With times, he can even go anywhere. So adaptability of innate and stored patterns of movement. So these motor patterns are already stored in the brain, in the motor cortex, and they are available at birth and are subjected to maturation. As the child grows older, the movement patterns of the child changes. The child that was crawling starts walking. After some time, the child that was learning how to walk starts running around the house, you see? So that is adaptability of innate stored patterns of movement. So in the clinical application, we have cerebral palsy, which we had already talked about, which has to do with damage to the cortical areas and parts of the brain that control voluntary movements. We have the factors responsible for cerebral palsy, which you have to read up. We have the symptoms of cerebral palsy. We have the sensory deficits as well accompanying cerebral palsy. Then we have the types of cerebral palsy, which I want you to also read up. So those are the types of cerebral palsy. There's no cure for it. The treatment has to do with injections to affected muscle to reduce muscle spasticity, in the muscles. So thank you for listening. I hope to see you again, and I hope to send to you another recording. Thank you.